Today's scripture reading is from Genesis 6, verse 5 through 22. The Lord saw the wickedness of the humans was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humans on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart.
So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the humans I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord.
These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence, and God saw the earth was corrupt, for all these flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth.
And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch.
This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it lower, second, and third decks.
For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, to destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you.
And of everything of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark. To keep them alive with you, you shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kind, and of the animals according to their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come into you, to keep them alive.
Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this, he did all that God commanded him.
As Jay noted, we've been taking some time this year to look at stories and the power that they have to shape us. The fact that we as human beings are not just embodied creatures, we are enstoried creatures. Our character, our habits, our values, our virtues, our vices, all of these come to us at least in part through story. And now we're diving into some specific biblical stories. Last week looking at the story of Esther, and this week looking at the story of Noah. And I realized that I've been pastoring for close to 16 years, which makes me feel a little bit old. So I preached somewhere probably in the order of 600, 650 sermons, something like that. And I don't think I have ever preached on the story of Noah. I've talked about it, I've mentioned it in passing, but I don't think I've ever preached an entire sermon about it. And I was reflecting on why that is. And I think in part it's because the thing that seems to fascinate people so much about the story of Noah just doesn't interest me all that much. The main thing that people jump to when they encounter this story, like good heirs of the Enlightenment, modern people that we are, the main thing that we jump to is, did this really happen? When we read the story of Noah, are we reading history the way that we understand history, a factual depiction of something that actually took place in the past? And there are people who really, really, really care about this question. They don't agree, but they really care about this question. There's somebody who cares so much about this question that he built a whole replica in Kentucky. Like, he's really invested in the question of, are we dealing with history here? And then there are others who care equally about the question but come to the opposite conclusion, right? But what they seem to agree on, even in the midst of their disagreement, is that if you can resolve this question, if you can answer once and for all whether this is history or not, it will tell you everything you need to know about not just this story, but about the Christian faith and maybe life itself. And for me, I just don't see it that way. I have some thoughts, I have some opinions, I've done some reading and some research. I'm curious, but for me, the question of historicity, to use a fancy word, the question of whether this actually happened or not is not the most important question. And I'm not the only one who thinks this way. The Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann, who passed away recently, actually offered this warning when coming to this text. He says, our interpretation will be distracted if there is insistence on finding data to prove that this is a, quote, historical narrative. Our interpretation will be distracted If that's the thing we fixate on, we might actually miss the point of what's going on. We might fail to see the forest because we're so fixated on one particular tree. But Brueggemann goes on to say, he says, with equal firmness, we must deny that this is, quote, a myth expressed in Israel just as in every other ancient culture. So that's one of the things that's kind of interesting about this story is there are versions of this story, of a flood story, that exist in other traditions outside of the Israelite tradition. And this is not a new insight. Even you go all the way back to the time of Jesus, and there was a historian by the name of Josephus coming out of the Israelite tradition who looked at this story and said, boy, this is awfully similar to what the Babylonians were saying. So it's not a new insight to notice that there are similarities across cultures in dealing with these flood narratives. But Brueggemann says that's not actually what this story is doing. It's not just one more version of this story. Brueggemann says that our focus should be on the disclosure of God in this text, and the ways in which that disclosure recharacterizes the world. In other words, the question is not, did this really happen? The question is, what is the plot of this story? And the plot of this story, Brueggemann and others contend, is not actually the flood. The flood is not plot so much as setting. It's the environment in which the action takes place, the action being the relationship between God and God's creation, and the state of that relationship, and God's own response to the state of that relationship. What we read in the text is that the earth has become filled with violence, and this grieves God. God, in some translations, like in the King James, God repents, which is, man, a theologically loaded phrase. God repents of ever having made humans. The violence on the earth is so severe that it threatens to undo God's creative act. And so the question seems to be not what happened with the water and the animals. The question seems to be what is going on with God and God's creation. We might say that this text is setting out to put two questions before us. One is a question about the nature and character of God. Is God faithful to God's creation? And the other question is about the nature and character of humans. Can humans uncreate what God has created? Through our violence, through our actions, can we undo what God has already done? Now, most of us, we're sitting here in church on Sunday morning. We have likely some familiarity with the biblical story, the Christian story. We have some ready-made stock answers to difficult questions. Right? And if the questions are, is God faithful and can humans undo what God has done? We have really easy answers for those. Yes, God is faithful. No, humans cannot undo what God has done. It's really easy for us to answer those questions. We sang a whole bunch of songs this morning talking about God's faithfulness as a settled, established fact that is really beyond question. And while I think that may be true objectively, I know that it is not always true experientially. Like all of us may know and even be able to say, yes, God is faithful, but all of us have lived through things in our lives where we wonder, we question, is God actually as faithful as I've been taught to believe God is? And what the flood story seems to do is put that question before us in such a way that we can't give these easy, pat answers. We can't just reflexively say, of course God is faithful, let's not talk about it anymore and move on. Of course humans can't undo what God has done, let's not talk about it anymore, let's move on. The flood story puts these questions to us in provocative and powerful ways to really probe and question, is God faithful? And what is the extent of the power, the capability of human violence to undo what God has done? But it's not just the flood story that does this. We can point to other examples of history where these questions have come to the fore in ways that demand a deeper response than just our stock, pat answers, especially when we think about the extent of human violence and its impact on creation.
From the shelled and bombed cities of Italy, Greece, and France, refugees have fled toward some pitiful mirage of safety. Close to 30 million Europeans have been driven from their homes or shipped like livestock from one country to another to serve as slave labor or to satisfy the hateful racial ideas of the enemy. Destruction has sapped the life of a continent. Millions of homes of the common man lie in irreparable ruin. Railways, lifelines of supplies for everyday life, and public utilities Electric power and water supply have been smashed. Harbor and dock facilities have been wrecked by retreating armies and are temporarily useless. Spiritual institutions have not escaped, their work in many instances cut off.
In the aftermath of the human violence of World War II, it seemed like creation itself was coming undone. Just utter devastation everywhere you look. And that newsreel, I think it came out of Canada, and so it describes this as the actions of the enemy. But I wonder what lengths were the Allies prepared to go to in this violent struggle? What were the Allies willing to risk? Now, this is a fictionalized account from Christopher Nolan's film Oppenheimer, but it describes something very real that happened during the testing of the Manhattan Project at Los Alamos, where researchers were trying to actually break apart God's basic building block of creation, the atom itself. What God had joined together, humans were trying to put asunder. And there was this question, once we start this process, can we ever stop it? And physicists had to research this question. And they actually published their research, they declassified it after the fact. The abstract, the introduction to this paper says, it is shown that whatever the temperature to which a sector of the atmosphere may be heated, no self-propagating chain of nuclear reaction is likely to be started. And then there's a whole bunch of math that goes on in the paper. I don't understand it because I'm not a physicist. But then at the end of the paper, they come back and they say there remains the distant probability that some other less simple mode of burning may maintain itself in the atmosphere. So even if this one thing we're worried about doesn't happen, there's a chance something else could happen. And even if the reaction is stopped, the resultant earth shock and radioactive contamination of the atmosphere might become catastrophic on a worldwide scale. Now, they never actually put a number to it, at least not in terms that I could understand in this paper. But some scientists who were there said the working theory was the chances were about 1 in 3 million, which just as a frame of reference is about 100 times more likely than someone winning the Powerball. And this is to destroy the entire planet. And right up until the time they tested the Trinity device, they still weren't entirely sure. And so there's this physicist, Enrico Fermi, who's making bets. He's talking to his other physicists, putting a little money on the side. Do you think we're going to light the atmosphere on fire? And if so, will it just be contained above the skies of New Mexico? Or is it actually going to wipe out the whole world? So I wonder, do you have a number? How many sides would have to be on those dice for you to roll them, to take the chance of actually destroying God's creation? Human violence has this incredibly destructive potential to undo what God has done. And you don't even have to speculate about nuclear weapons. There are plenty of examples that come from what we call, quote unquote, conventional weapons. Think about the country of Laos, where unexploded cluster munitions make about half of what should be farmland completely and totally unusable. Or Gaza, where there's 61 million metric tons of rubble that they currently estimate will take about a decade to remove. Not to rebuild, just to actually get the rubble out of there. Or parts of Ukraine. Human violence has this incredibly destructive potential to undo what God has done, to uncreate parts of creation. And the flood story brings us face to face with this possibility. Right? The flood story tells of a time when it seems like it actually was happening. The world was coming apart as a result of human violence. The chaos out of which God had formed the order of the world, that chaos was coming back into control. But it's not just in the flood that this happens. We have examples from our own times, our own history, our own lives, times when human violence has undone creation at a nearly unimaginable scale. And so if human violence has that potential, then what do we say about God and God's faithfulness? Is God faithful? Does God find a way, in the midst of the destructive potential of human violence, does God find a way to sustain creation and to recreate creation when we have tried to undo it? What does God do in response? I want to turn our attention back to the time of World War II and some of the efforts that were undertaken in the face of this widespread devastation to try to rebuild creation, to reestablish an environment that humans could live in with dignity and in peace. And I want you to listen to some of the efforts that were undertaken as part of that recreative effort.
In the first 6 months alone, Europe will need 5 million tons of wheat to be provided mostly from the farms of Canada. Eggs and egg powder from the United States and Canada will supplement the huge requirement of 800,000 tons of meat. Europe is in rags. Clothing will have to be provided to protect health and life itself. Medical supplies and equipment will be of first importance at a time when epidemics and bodily breakdowns will be on the increase. Most of these relief measures will be useless unless European agriculture is restored on a sound working basis. The New World must be ready to supply fertilizers to enrich impoverished and scorched soils, seed for planting, since vital seed reserves have been used for food. And to further enable Europe to produce 4/5 of its own food supply, livestock will be required to replenish its depleted herds.
So you have this emergency relief that's needed. You need to get grain in there. You need to get eggs and egg powder in there. You need to get meat in there. But that's not sustainable over the long term. And so what's actually needed is to rebuild what has been destroyed. Because as armies were going along, both Axis and Allied powers, and there were farms there, they would often just slaughter those animals to feed their armies. So you have this situation where you have an entire continent that has been just devastated. Creation has come undone as a result of human violence. And here's this desire to try to rebuild that which has fallen apart. But how do you do it? You have a whole continent. The railways are destroyed. Some of the ports are messed up. All of the animals on that continent have been, not all of them, but many of the animals on that continent have been killed. How do you rebuild the herds in enough time to actually rescue people from starving? Just in the region surrounding Gdańsk in Poland, the estimated livestock number went from 600,000 to 6,000 during the war. So what do you do? Well, much like in the days of Noah, you're going to need a big boat, and you're going to need a whole bunch of animals. And this is exactly what they set out to do. Not just one boat, but dozens of boats. They took boats that had been built recently as troop carriers, Victory class and Liberty class boats, and they started retrofitting these to, in essence, be floating farms. And they would take livestock from the United States and Canada, and they would load them onto these boats, and they would ship them across the sea as a donation to try to rebuild the agricultural industry in Europe. And this was coordinated under a new agency that had been formed, what is now the United Nations. And so they formed the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration. It's called UNRWA. And UNRWA had a lot of capacity. It could get these boats. It could get some of the animals even. It could get crews to man the boats. But what it didn't have that it needed was people to take care of the animals. I don't know if you know this, but navigating the high seas is really complex, difficult work. And raising animals is really complex, difficult work. And those skill sets don't often exist in exactly the same person. Right? So UNRWA says we've got boats, we've got animals, we've got crews, but we need people to try to keep these animals alive on the 3 weeks it takes to get across the sea. And this is where God's church comes in. Because there had already been a group, mostly associated with the Church of the Brethren, who had been thinking about this sort of thing. There's a guy by the name of Dan West who had been doing some relief work in Spain after the Civil War, and he'd been passing out milk. And he realized what these people need is not milk, they need a cow. Like, how can we just get a cow over here? And so they had started experimenting, prototyping. They had gotten some animals to Puerto Rico. That's about as far as they had made it, but they were brainstorming, how do we do this kind of work? And then the United Nations comes calling. It says, do you think you would have any farmers? So they started putting these ads in Anabaptist periodicals, looking for mostly young men who were willing to give up some of their time to go get on a boat and care for animals as they were transported from the United States over to Europe. And hundreds, if not thousands of young people responded. And what they did is they would enlist them in the Merchant Marines. Here's an ID card from Martin Brubaker, who I think is Doris Souter's uncle. They were generous enough to lend me one of their photo books from their family. He was 17 years old, and goes from a farm in Mount Joy and gets on this boat, the Charles W. Wooster in Baltimore. And this boat would go from Baltimore to Germany. Ultimately, the cows on board were supposed to end up in Czechoslovakia. But unlike in Noah's day, it wasn't just one ship. There are over 70 ships involved in this. This is a photo from another of the crews. Somewhere in this picture or maybe taking the picture, I'm not 100% sure, is Earl Rohr, whom some of you might remember from his time here, Miriam's husband. Earl was 18 years old when he got on this ship for this 3-week journey across the ocean, sorry. Or this is the SS Clarksville Victory. And Leroy Petersheim went on this boat. Some of you might remember Leroy. Leroy was 16 years old. And as far as I know, the furthest he had gotten from Morgantown before this was maybe to Lancaster, which is not very far. And he somehow finds his way at 16 years old to get himself to Houston, Texas, and then to get on this boat, which goes all the way to Greece. 16 years old. And Leroy actually, I'm not sure Leroy belonged on a boat. Leroy he had so much courage. I don't know that the sense had quite caught up with the courage. He used to tell this story that they were in a patch of really, really rough seas, and he was so fascinated by what was happening because the front of the boat would come up and then would come crashing down, and the back would come up so the propeller would actually come out of the water, and he went out and stood on the deck to watch this happen, and a wave comes over the deck and catches him. And it is only because his foot caught on something that he did not end up swept completely overboard, out to sea, gone forever. But Leroy was on this boat to care for, I think, 19 mules. That was his responsibility. And there were so many men that responded to this need, to be on this boat, feeding these animals, cleaning out their stalls, assisting with births, because they would often try to send pregnant animals, because that's a way to sort of multiply your impact once you're over there. At times they would have to dispose of animals who had died to get them overboard. And this project, in the span of a couple years, moved almost 250,000 horses, mules, heifers, and bulls. Plus they had an assortment of smaller animals, some sheep, some goats, some chickens. It's just absolutely incredible to me. The fact that you had these young men, and I think a few women, who were willing to give up their time. They were paid a little bit. They got a small stipend. I think their pay from the merchant marines was $1 just to actually make them legal to function as merchant marines. Then they got a little extra stipend, but it's not like they were making a lot of money. But they were going to try to participate in this rebuilding effort. Human violence had broken creation apart. Right? Things were not working. An entire continent had been destroyed, its livestock herds decimated, in some cases literally. And here is God's faithfulness at work. A bunch of young boys, a couple women, who've been raised in the church, who saw a need and said, what can I do to respond to this need? They weren't necessarily experts, again, like Leroy, I think Earl. These are not folks who had spent a lot of time at sea. They hadn't spent a lot of time outside of Pennsylvania. But here they were, giving of their time. So what was it that made this possible? How did God bring about this type of deliverance, this type of rescue and rebuilding effort? How did God do this work? If you want to see more pictures from this group of folks, became known as the Seagoing Cowboys. During the postlude, we're going to play a little video that was put together with a band out of Indiana, I think, and a historian by the name of Peggy Rife Miller, who's done some really remarkable work compiling and documenting some of these stories. So you'll have a chance to see more of that. But I want to think a little bit more. What were the conditions that created the sorts of people who were prepared to do this kind of work? And I wonder if in part, this may have been Leroy or Earl or Martin's first time ever setting foot on an actual physical boat. But in a sense, they had been growing up on a boat their entire lives. This is one of the metaphors that shows up throughout church history, is thinking about the church itself as a ship or as a boat, sometimes called the ship of Peter. This is an Eastern Orthodox icon where you see the church, the apostles, the saints, with Jesus at the helm, navigating rough and stormy seas. It's not just in Orthodox art. You can see this in Proto-Renaissance Catholic art. The ship is the church. The church is navigating, bringing people through these rough waters, these forces of chaos and violence, bringing them toward safety and salvation. It shows up sometimes in church architecture. If you've seen the latest Rian Johnson Knives Out film, maybe you remember that this pulpit, I think I should have a pulpit like this, man. This pulpit, what does it look like? It looks like the prow of a ship. This is not unintentional. The church has understood itself. For hundreds of years, if not thousands of years, the church has understood itself as a ship, as God's means of bringing about salvation. When human violence threatens to undo creation, God always has a boat. And this boat is the church. God's means of bearing people, bearing aspects of creation through chaos, through violence, through stormy seas, bearing us toward salvation. Now, there can be a little bit of a shadow side to this, right? Where we think about a ship as being maybe hermetically sealed, completely cut off, not at all in contact with the world. But the most important thing for the church is to make sure we're safe no matter what's happening in the world around us. And you can see that narrative playing out in the story of some of these seagoing cowboys, especially who were from more conservative Anabaptist groups. Some of them actually came back from their voyages and were excommunicated because their church said, we don't do that sort of thing here. So there is a shadow side. But a ship at its best is always supposed to be in contact with the ocean. Always. And so if we are the church, if we are God's ship bearing people into salvation through the mess and chaos of the world, we need to be in contact with the world around us. And sometimes those waves wash up. It comes into the church. The chaos and the violence out there finds its way in here, and that is okay because God is faithful. So the story of Noah challenges us. It challenges us to think about who God is, what God's character is like. Is God really faithful? But it also challenges us to think about ourselves. What are we capable of? When we get caught up in spirals and cycles of violence, what are we capable of? Right before the story of Noah is introduced, we meet a character named Lamech who boasts about the fact that he has killed a man just for wounding him. It says if Cain is avenged 7 times, Lamech is avenged 77 times. He is turning up the retribution of violence as far as it can go. And when humans get caught in these patterns, this violence threatens to undo creation itself. And so when we find ourselves cooperating or being complicit in the forces of violence in the world, we need to be cautious because we are participating in undoing what God has done. Yet God remains faithful. God always has a ship. God always has a means of deliverance. God has chosen to use the church as God's means of bearing people through the chaos and violence and dysfunction of the world, of bearing people toward salvation and safety. And we get to be part of that journey. We might not have the sorts of opportunities that Leroy and Earl and Martin and these other seagoing cowboys had, but we will always have opportunities to respond to the aftermath of violence in our world, to be people who join in God's work of recreating and restoring creation when human action threatens to undo it. God is faithful, and we can be part of God's means of expressing that faithfulness to the world. Would you pray with me? Gracious and merciful God, we give you thanks for your faithfulness. It is not something that we can take for granted. We acknowledge that at times it's difficult to recognize your faithfulness, to truly feel experientially that you are faithful to us and to creation. And so we give you thanks for the story of Noah, for the story of Jesus, for the story of so many faithful people who have demonstrated your faithfulness to the world. And we pray, God, that we would join in that long line of faithfulness. That we would be people who faithfully participate on board this ship of salvation that you call the church, bringing goodness and peace and inviting people to journey out of violence toward what you desire for us. And we pray that you would continue this work in the precious name of Christ. Amen.